Pastor Melissa Early asks, would the Magi have been as interested in finding this newborn king if they had only had to go around the corner? She goes on to describe a time in her own life when she was visiting Peru. She allowed herself to get lost in a kind of cultural pilgrimage, and times in which she usually would have been uptight about not being able to speak the language or exchange money, she gave herself over unto the moment of the day and found herself winding through unfamiliar but inviting streets. And I think that she offers this to us because sometimes we have to shake things up a bit, sometimes to leave home, indeed to get a bit of a distance between us and what is familiar. This is the Spirit's unveiling for us, an opportunity to relinquish some of what has become routinized within us in the last year and maybe years before, in order to pay more attention to what is going on, perhaps in the sky, or in the voices and the crackles of the people around us. We see these wise persons, the Magi today, studying the sky and ready to make a move to reach their next step. But I have a feeling they were ready in their bones for adventure, perhaps gathering those camels and finding a way winding in order to follow the star that had been speaking out to them with a sense of immediacy and urgency, that sense that you cannot stay here any longer, you need to go. And perhaps in contrast, or within the story we find that it's in concert, we hear of Joseph having dreams, telling him where it is that he is supposed to go. For him, there is the mortal threat, as we've heard it, of Herod and his successor who would take the throne too. In Matthew, we see the Holy Family cross the border, and we know this term for us today as refugees. Both the Magi and the Holy Family receive that message. You cannot stay here. You need to go. At certain of our own crossroads, whether it is compelling curiosity born of a particular moment in our seasoned age and stage, our intellectual or our spiritual curiosity, we are told this same message that you cannot stay here. You need to go. And for some, there is not the luxury of pondering and sitting with it and allowing it to steep. There is the urgency of bombs going off in the background. And you're told, you cannot stay here. As the whispers on the street tell us, as all of Bethlehem is afraid of the executioners that would come, you need to go. Do not delay. Heed the dream. Feel the inner nudging. Watch the star if you need to go, go, go. The Spirit speaks to us on this precipice of the new year as we hear the call by this road. We celebrate the being birthed that happens on the Christmas road of which we have been a part and which these days continue to help us in our celebration. And then as we hit that pivot point, you heard it in the disruption that happened. We welcome the kings, we sing of the myrrh and the frankincense and the gold, and we reach that pivot point in the journey where it would be convenient to stop going and sit there for the remainder of the bathing in that star. But no, we see it, we hear it in the pausing and the urgency of two voices that break in and say, that's not the full story. We have the Epiphany detour. We can end up in a different place than when we started. And just like when we get our phones out to navigate even the closest of places, when we take a turn that is telling us not to, what does it say? Rerouting, rerouting, rerouting. And aren't we so glad that it does? It has been programmed and chipped so that we can find our way even when we turn off course if it's going the other way. But sometimes, I know it happens sometimes, friends, you know where you're going better than it does. And in such case, you make the turn that you know that you want to take, even though it wants you to go another way. Sometimes our bodies are like this. Sometimes we have to actively think through, oh, there is a detour on 108 forever. I need to find a different circumstance and way to go. And so we take that is part of the instinct, the gut principle that it is our very bodies, where even though the map might say one thing, we might say another, and we start moving, and then what happens? Recalculating, 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 and it gets on page. and programmed. And we find a different way on the map and we go the direction that we feel now this is the way to go. The gift we find at Christmas upon our arrival to the place where Jesus is, for many of us, feels so familiar and welcome. We cherish the Christmas carols as we've heard them throughout Christmas Eve and beyond. We unpack the beloved ornaments for the tree. We pull out the cookie recipes like at my house to feel and spread Christmas cheer. They can all be gifts unto us. Many delight in this time with friends and family, although we admit that sometimes it changes over the years when there may be not that same friends and family there. But we come to this story knowing that there are yet hard decisions waiting on the other side as we await with Joseph and Mary. Christmas is not an escape from the hard realities of our everyday world. Indeed, the Christmas story contains them. Especially there's a part where the wise persons arrived. It's a stark reminder that Christmas is always a preparation, a rerouting time, when we are going to be called a different way before we get back to Christmas again. We crave the Christmas brings familiarity because we know, as we heard them say, the inevitability of change. And if we can approach what comes next with the carols of Christmas roads still ringing in our ears and our spirits, perhaps we will have renewed courage to admit that we are scared of what the star may tell us next, of the dream that will come, of the steps we will be required to take. For we know, and looking simply just out at these last years, we know how quickly wars can erupt, political factions can shift, pandemics can hit, that we, along with the Magi and the Holy Family, are required to recalculate our journeys based on what we will face. Recently, Adam and I watched the movie The Swimmers. Perhaps this is one you have seen. I recommend it unto you. It was put out just this last fall. This is a story of two Syrian sisters fleeing the violence of their home country in 2015. Yusra and Sarah, Yusra 17 and Sarah 20 at the time, flee with their cousin, hoping to reach Germany, as they've heard in the news, a place for some secure asylum for their parents and younger sister to hopefully join them. There are many aspects of their harrowing journey that are depicted as they have to negotiate with smugglers, as they have to scale borders, as they have to seek food and water in the midst of crippling fatigue. But the most harrowing part of their journey is across the Aegean Sea in a flimsy, inflatable boat with 16 other refugees from various countries. Sarah and Yusra, who grew up swimming with their dad as their coach, have trained as Olympians. He hopes one day that they will swim for Syria. But instead, here they are putting those life skills to the test right there in the bedraggled oceans, waters, the seas, waters. And so they jump out of the boat in order to lighten the load when the motor fails. They help to drag the boat the rest of the way. It should have been about a 45-minute bobbing across that water, and it took a nightmarish 3.5 hours. They eventually, after a long while navigating both on that water and then through the lands, they eventually make it to Germany, in part thanks to some extended humanitarian measures to grant wider access in the face of such a crisis. And upon arrival, they face months and months of processing and uncertainty, and they are not able to secure passage for the rest of their family at that time. But they do find an element of home, as we trust that even when we are rerouted and recalculated, even if they're not going to be getting right back to the same place that we are, for they don't make it back to Syria, but especially Yusra does make it to a pool. And for her, that becomes a means for her continual living out into the continued practice of her family and the connection of her body as she seeks to grow stronger and work towards that goal she had to make it to the Olympics. It's this journey homeward that she finds, that pivot that she has made, that long rerouting, that uncomfortable place of urgency of which she has escaped with her life. And when she jumps back into the water, she faces the tragedy of flashbacks of what it was to be in the sea. But with time and the innate ability for her body to adapt in with her spirit, she lives into this new goal, one that she lives out not only for herself, because she feels she is swimming on behalf of her people. Not just her people, but all of the refugees who are so desperately needing to go another road. And so she works very hard. She finds that pool. She finds an instructor named Sven, and they work and they work and they work until she makes it to Rio in 2016. She gets to swim among the many who are gathered there. She doesn't swim for Syria in this case. She swims instead for a refugee team that has been cobbled together. And so she is not just among her brethren and sisters of that home country, but suddenly she is joined by people from all over the world who have been displaced. It is to say, I see you, that displayed on that triumphant stage as they enter the Colosseum there. Not only are those who proudly live where they live and are at home where they're at home, but there are those that represent some of the 30 million and more who are displaced around this country to say, we find a home when we are doing what it is, the gifts that we have, and we are presenting them, not just for ourselves, but as Yusra, she became a goodwill ambassador afterwards, speaks on behalf of refugees. Friends, I am staggeringly overwhelmed every time I read of the humanitarian crises that face us in this world. It's easy to become so overwhelmed to shut it out, to try and fathom the 10 plus years of constant battle in Syria that has been happening, or look to places like Afghanistan or Venezuela or the Sudan, and imagine people on flimsy boats even now trying to make it across the sea. At one point, as they emerge onto Lesbos, the island there in Greece, the camera pans out and they take off their life jackets. And there are thousands of life jackets littering the beach, representing our widened humanity and our ongoing crisis, by which some are required to go a road that takes them there, with the deepest of hope that they will reach safety. Friends, it's in the deep place of this that I find, Valerie, the poem you brought before us today. These stark terms that make us shudder. In the group, I kept saying that they made me feel so spicy. And what I meant by this was, you know, when a poem, a scripture, a reading, something someone says, puts your feet to the fire in an uncomfortable way, that you know you might have to chart a different direction when you read it. There's closer to this jumping off point when the lessons of Christmas apply to our next actions, not in a predictable pattern, but on this new road. If I am to make room for the new birth and to follow the Spirit into the next phase of my journey, I go without a convenient script. We are indeed rerouting. I go with circumventing the evils, we pray, of this world, but also calling them out in my very own being and complicity. And at home, in the palace of my ego, my own Herod quakes. Oh, that I could go a different road. I come back straight to that Herod from where she was sitting before Christmas, then I have missed it. I have failed to recalculate. I've missed the stars in the sky that are crying out their revolution. I've missed seeing the migrant family and their continuing needs. Perhaps I'm yet blind to them today, preferring the fastest route back from from Christmas. I know the unease that meets many of us when we are asked to contemplate the next steps of our future, whether as church or our personhood. Some of us face, as many in our congregation have, that downsizing and that moving to another state, as Vicki has done, and as Art is moving to Riderwood, and the Gillens have moved to Michigan, and Joan has moved to North Carolina, and Ellen and Paul are in Florida. We hope many of you are on today. Because the other road keeps bringing you back here where we find the truth in this message of love that is persistent and goes where we go. So receive that blessing here, friends, of bold love, that as Christmas would continue to emanate and to prosper in our hearts, that even as January 6th, Epiphany Day, comes, that we would allow the Spirit to recalculate us.